Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our weekly briefing. We're going to give an update on a number of items as Chief turns his phone off. But before we do anything, I do want to acknowledge that one of our neighbors, Chari Alasorio, passed away yesterday from the shooting last Saturday night. It was a horrific tragedy and a horrific outcome, and I just want Chariel's family and loved ones to know that you are very much in my thoughts. I want to thank Deputy Mayor Sharon Owens for joining me as usual, and Chief Kenton Buckner. I want to thank the Common Council for allowing us the use of the chambers. In terms of what we're going to cover today, we've got a full agenda, and Chief Buckner does have to leave before 2 o'clock, so we're going to go move things around a little bit. But we'll do our update on COVID-related matters, including the Phase 4 reopening, give an update on parks. I want to acknowledge our Commissioner of Parks, Julie LaFave, is here. And we will give our weekly census report update. Also our weekly CompStat report update. We're going to talk about fireworks. We will talk about last Saturday's incident over on the west side at Wyoming and Marcellus Streets. We'll talk about protests, and we will take questions. Also police reform. So on COVID, as of yesterday, cases in the city, 1,540. That's up 110 cases since last week. That's a 7.7% increase. For recoveries, we are at 1,101. That's up 202 in a week, and that's a 22% increase in recoveries. So once again, the growth of recoveries is significantly outpacing the growth of new cases, and that's a good thing. We want to see that continue. I want to remind everyone that testing is ongoing at the Syracuse Community Health Center, including today and tomorrow until 5 p.m. I mentioned that we are officially in Phase 4 of the reopening process. That's great news, as we're trying to get our community and our economy back on track, having higher education, more arts and entertainment activities, low-risk activities happening, getting media production, including our growing film industry, going again, are all really good things for our economy and our spirit. We are continuing to see businesses reopening and affirming with the state. We're up to 527 businesses in the city of Syracuse that have affirmed through the state's process. That's 56 new ones since our last update in the city. We're headed in the right direction, and as we look around the country, we can see a lot of communities that are headed in the opposite direction. So it's an important reminder that the reason we've made it this far is because of these and because of this, and we cannot lose sight of what's at risk here. And we talk about the reopening process, bringing our community up from the long pause, and we don't want to put at risk that progress. And so everyone needs to continue to wear a mask. They need to continue to distance and follow the rules. And right now we are a model for the entire country, and that's something we should all be very proud of. So as we reopen, some updates. As some of you may have noticed this past week, or at the beginning of the week, we opened our playgrounds and our water features. We've had quite a stretch of hot weather, hot and dry weather. Everyone's looking for relief, and at the beginning of this week we were able to open up a number of our water features: our Burnett Park Mister, water feature at Comfort Tyler Park, Fraser School spray feature, McKinley Park spray area, Thornton Park spray circle, Union Park spray area, Lower Onondaga spray feature, Schiller Park mushroom, Skiddy Park Mister, and the Lewis Park spray block. All of those are up and running, more to come, and our playgrounds are all open. I want to remind everyone that the playgrounds are not regularly sanitized, so people need to use them at their own risk. Again, practicing the same health habits that have gotten us this far, washing hands, are all really important to keep everyone healthy. But it is, as I think we're starting to learn, there is a way to be more active and to be able to have some fun, but to do it in a safe way, and that's our goal in parks. So that was the good news at the beginning of the week in parks. And the good news at the end of this week in parks is that we're going to open some pools. I've probably been asked about pools more than any other part of our reopening process. And I've talked about the very challenging fiscal conditions that have limited our options with pools. But effective July 16th, because we need a ramp-up time, we're going to be opening up 2 pools, Kirk Park Pool down on the south side and Schiller Park Pool on the north side. So they will open, again, on July 16th. They'll be open 7 days a week for free open swim from noon to 6 p.m. Schiller Park Pool will also offer lap swim Monday through Friday, 6:30 a.m. to 10 a.m., and that's $3. Open swim and lap swim will be by reservation only in 40-minute time blocks. So that's obviously new. That's to make sure that we can keep it safe and keep it organized. So we will, everyone will be allowed 1 time slot per day. You can make reservations by calling a dedicated phone line that we'll, of course, share for each pool, and we'll post that information on the park's website. I mentioned Commissioner LaFave is here. I want to thank her and her whole team, as well as our building trades team, for making this happen. This is no small undertaking. I also want to recognize the American Red Cross for extending lifeguard certification dates, which has helped us to be ready with lifeguards for this summer. So, good news is 2 pools. Bad news is that leaves 6 pools unopened. Again, we know that it's a fiscal issue, but I want to keep going. I've told the Parks team that I challenged them to come up with a plan. They came up with a plan that allow us to open up 4 pools. I said we're opening up 2, and the way we get to 4 is by getting some help from everyone in the community. Thanks to our great partners at the Syracuse Parks Conservancy. I want to recognize Chris Wiles from the Conservancy, who's here with us today. We are launching a fundraising campaign today. The goal is to raise $100,000 in the next week, again, no small undertaking, to help offset the cost of opening 2 additional city pools for this summer season. Those 2 pools are Onondaga Park Pool and Thorndon Park Pool, taking care of the west side or the southwest side and the east side. So the goal is to get a pool open in each quadrant of the city. Again, we're halfway there, or we'll be halfway there on July 16th, but we want to get all the way there. So we have officially launched a GoFundMe page, which you can find right now on the Parks Department Facebook page. We'll make sure we share it on all of our platforms. I'm pleased to report we've already raised $1,300 just since the page went live, and we're having active conversations with private donors as we speak. But $100,000 is a lot of money. We know that there's a lot of need out in the community, but the reality is, as I weighed the fiscal impact that COVID-19 has had on this city and the desperate need for federal financial aid, I weighed that with our young people in the city, many of whom pools are the highlight of their summer. And when I thought about letting our kids down at this really difficult time for everyone, it broke my heart, and that's why we decided that we were willing to step up and to get those 2 pools open, and based on what we've heard from the community, we have confidence in our community's ability to step up as well and help us get those other 2 pools open. So the campaign is #SyracuseSwimsOn. We encourage you to use the hashtag in your social media platforms, and again, get on that GoFundMe page, whether it's $5, $10, $100, whatever you can afford. Again, this is the highlight of our kids' summer in the city, and they've been through a rough stretch like the rest of us. They haven't been able to see their friends at school in recent months. Let's give them a summer that they'll never forget. I talked about the need for resources, and I always connect that back to our census. We are still underway with the self-response process related to the census. The good news is we do continue to see incremental growth in our self-response rate, but it is continuing to slow down, so we're at 49% right now. That's up just a little bit from 48.9% last week. We continue to trend right along with our upstate counterparts. Buffalo's at 49.2, Rochester's at 47.2, and Albany's at 49.3. I really want everyone to not only make sure that you filled out your census, but just mention it to your family, mention it to your friends, your neighbors. It really is critically important to make sure that we get the resources we need, whether it's to open up pools or to take care of our most vulnerable populations. Crime, something we've unfortunately been talking a lot about lately. We've been tracking our weekly crime stats via ComStat, which again is located on our SyracusePolice.org website. The good news is we did see the numbers headed back in the right direction. So the past couple of weeks we had slipped. We have continued to be well below last year's total Part 1 crime at this point this year, but last year we were at 8% below last year, or last week we were 8% below last year. This week we're 9%, so we saw improvement. That's good. Unfortunately, when you dig down a little bit deeper, what you'll see is we're continuing to slip in violent crime, and I think that's evident to anyone who's been paying attention. So last week we were at minus 5%, and this week we're at minus 3% for violent crime. But again, the good news is Part 1 property crime was at minus 9%. Last week and is at minus 10% this week. So that's the trend that we want to see continue, and we want to get our violent crime headed back in that direction as well. But again, overall, better than we were at this time last year, and when you look at that 5-year average, we're 24% below in total Part 1 crime. So despite some of the horrific incidents that we see, it's important that we keep a broader perspective about where we are with crime, but always know that we can and intend to do better. A crime that we've been talking about a lot lately and hearing lately is fireworks. So I want to give everyone an update on fireworks. They continue to be a problem every night. I hear them every night at my house, and I get a lot of tweets and texts and Facebook messages from a lot of other folks in the city that hear them. We've talked about the multiple issues that they cause. Certainly a quality of life issue, keep people up at night. But they're dangerous. We know that they start fires. We've had that happen already this year. They can cause serious harm to people. And for those that are suffering from PTSD, it can be a significant trigger, and it's a real problem. So we can't have an either-or proposition where we're either focused on, only Part 1 violent crime or some of these more quality of life issues. We need to be able to focus on all of it. And I understand that's asking a lot of Chief Buckner and his team, but as they always do, when I asked, they stepped up. And I just want to remind everyone, as I talk about what we've been able to accomplish so far, that if you hear fireworks, call 911. We need to be able to track the data. So to date, this year, SPD has responded to 632 complaints for fireworks. They have dedicated, as we've talked about before, SPD has a dedicated nightly patrol focused just on fireworks, both responding to calls and also proactively seeking out fireworks. Thanks to that work, we have 6 seizures, significant seizures of illegal fireworks. You can see some of the photos behind me. Significant seizures, and those are fireworks we won't have to hear as we head into the holiday. So great job, Chief, and your team on those seizures. We've made 11 arrests. Again, our goal is not to arrest people, but people need to be held accountable. Those are in the form of appearance tickets. And again, because this can't just be about law enforcement, we're continuing our other strategies, including launching a public education campaign in partnership with our Department of Neighborhood and Business Development. And along those lines, we are going to be holding a public meeting on Monday at 5:30 p.m. As we head into the July 4th weekend. Again, we know for as much as we've been able to get off the streets, there's still a lot out there. It's going to continue to be a problem through the 4th of July. We need to educate our neighbors on how we can be safe heading into the holiday weekend. So I mentioned we want to talk about the shooting incident on the near west side late Saturday night. Chief Buckner is going to give an update. Obviously, they're still very much investigating the circumstances around what happened, how how we got to that point. I have no doubt that this is a learning opportunity for all of us, from SPD to community members. Everyone that I've talked to has been focused on how do we learn from this experience and make sure that it never happens again. I also want to say that, in times like this and with tragedies like this, for understandable reasons, we're all anxious to figure out who's to blame. And again, while I think everyone involved can learn from the situation, we should not confuse that with who's to blame. The individuals who pulled the triggers of those guns are to blame for those 9 individuals that were shot and that one young man who lost his life. It's the cowards that pull the trigger. That's who we should all be focused on holding accountable, and that's who I know the Syracuse Police Department is focused on holding accountable. So I want to ask Chief Buckner to give a quick update. Then we're going to hear from Deputy Mayor about police reform, and then we're going to pause for questions so Chief can get to his next event, and then I'll finish out with a few more items. So Chief Buckner.
Thank you. So there's been much said and a number of questions that wanted to speak about the timeline to which when police knew about the event. I can tell you that on the day in question at approximately 4:30 p.m., our Office of Public Affairs received information that a protest would be held in the parking lot. Later that day at 6:08 p.m., our officers, Uniform Division, received a call saying that a huge party was taking place. We checked that location, made contact with the promoters and individuals there that appeared to have some sort of responsibility, and then we cleared the call. Obviously, many other questions that have been asked about the violation of an executive order. We were consistent with our past in that we made contact, education awareness, and then tried to encourage those individuals to comply with the executive order. During that conversation with them, we were told that at some point that the party would be ending here in the near future. At 8:14 p.m., we checked the location again, clearing the location, and in both instances, there were no, other than the executive order, there was no illegal activity observed on the part of our officers. At 8:29, we responded to the area for a stolen vehicle type, and it was during the investigation of that stolen vehicle that individuals began running towards police, advising that shots were fired. There were a total of 9 victims that were actually shot there, one of which is now deceased. The other individuals are expected to make a full recovery. As a part of our investigation, we continue to do follow-up that focuses on 3 primary areas. That is processing the physical evidence, the gathering, locating, and interviewing of potential witnesses, and then there's much video data that we have to go through for various cameras that were in the area. All of this will at some point culminate in a file being presented to the district attorney's office, and then we will have a discussion about the appropriate charges and accountability for the individuals responsible for this heinous crime. That's kind of where we are with that shooting, and I guess we'll take questions now.
We'll have Deputy Mayor talk about reform, and then all things police related we'll take questions on. So Deputy Mayor, for those of you that tuned in last week, we announced my executive order, which included 16 provisions on police reform that's related to our ongoing dialogue with a number of community organizations and protest groups around the issue of police reform. And Deputy Mayor Owens has agreed to advance our reform efforts on behalf of the administration and is going to provide an update.
Yes, good afternoon. As the mayor just mentioned, I've been given what I consider to be the honor of moving forward on Syracuse police reform agenda here in the city of Syracuse. There are basically 3 phases. What we are doing right now is concentrating on moving forward the 16 elements of the executive order provisions to strengthen police accountability. We will be working with the council on the right to know implementation. All police SPD policies, we're working on having those posted as part of the executive order. working diligently. Some of them are already on the police website. We're working now to get them. You can imagine the size of the document and the logistics of that. But we'll be working diligently through next week to get that completed. I will also mention that the Police Department in the City of Syracuse has contracted with Lexipol. They are a national organization that automatically takes a look at police policies, updates them to align with all federal, state, and local laws, as well as 21st century policing. And we are going through that process as well. We actually were approved, legislation was approved to enter into that contract last year. So we are moving forward on that. So we will continue to populate the website with our policies, and we're working on that diligently. At the, we also have pulled together a internal working group to begin to look at the 16 items, to pull those apart, to begin to implement them, put some time frames around them so that we can fully implement what has been put forth in the police reform agenda and the executive order. At the mayor's request, I'm bringing together all parties of city government to act on all of those provisions. Next, we will be meeting with the coalition of protesters to begin to discuss their demands. I have reached back out to their organizing entity, SPARC, Syracuse Police Accountability and Reform Coalition, to negotiate an actual date when we will sit down and begin these discussions. I have heard back from that representation, and we are in the middle of determining what is the best date to begin that discussion. As requested by that coalition, that meeting will be live streamed here in the council chambers for the public to view, and we will be adhering absolutely to the parameters of the public health requirements of the executive order. So not only will we be determining a date, but determining how we can conduct the meeting under the protection and safety for everyone involved. Will be implementing full compliance with the governor's executive order 203, public reform and reinvention collaboration. I will be reaching out to council as indicated in the executive order. Whatever plan has been developed has to be approved by the council. The council has to be a active partner in this process. And that's it.
Great. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Now, again, we'll take questions on last Saturday's incident or any other police-related matters for Chief Buckner.
Chief, regarding the shooting Saturday, that's been described by the DA as gang-related, as a dispute between two gangs with at least 6 shooters. Is that information that you can confirm from your investigation?
Well, we have a well-documented practice that we certainly try to resist the urge to provide intimate information about ongoing investigations. Obviously, the purpose of that is for us to protect the integrity of that investigation, to allow us to be able to effectively conduct that investigation, find the appropriate witnesses, compile that file that we turn over to the DA's office. I will tell you that there were multiple shooters at that location, and that we do believe that there was some sort of gang-related incident that may have been a part of that.
Do you know what incident sparked the shootings?
I do not.
How many shell casings were found at the location?
I do not have that information. That's all a part of the collection of the physical evidence. As you can probably imagine, that was an enormous scene and a countless number of individuals that are potential witnesses to that.
What about suspects? Do you have suspects identified?
We have some suspects, but we're in the process of trying to connect the dots to make sure that when we charge these individuals that we ultimately get a conviction for this, and all of that is a part of the ongoing investigation.
And were any of the victims who were shot part of the dispute, to your knowledge, or were they all innocent bystanders?
Those are all questions that we hope to answer at the culmination of this investigation.
Thank Thanks.
Thank you.
Chief, are you getting tips and cooperation from witnesses who were at this party?
We've received a countless number of pieces of information from various people who are trying to assist us. That's one of the things that I can tell you about our community. Our homicide division has about a 90% or so clearance rate, and much of that is because of citizens in our community assisting us. Obviously, when you have a mass shooting like this, it shocks the conscience of our entire community, so we have had information shared with us.
Does this investigation change now that it's a homicide, and what message do you have for Cheriel Osorio's family right now?
Well, it changes in the sense that one of the charges will certainly be a homicide if the individual is found that was responsible for that shooting. And the message that I would have for that family is that we certainly continue to keep them in prayer. This is something that no family should have to experience on a day when that young man was having what we all would look back in our youth and see as one of the happiest days of our lives. No family should have to experience that. My goal today is to try to get that family some closure and find the individuals who are responsible for his homicide.
What about the organizer of this party or the Near West Side Initiative who granted permission? Will they be held accountable for holding this party in the first place and allowing it to happen?
All of those questions will be answered at the culmination of this investigation, and those are certainly viable questions and fair questions that we will talk with the district attorney's office in consultation with that to see what the appropriate avenues are going forward.
Do you feel any responsibility per se for not breaking up the party in the first place? I know that they told you that they were going to break up the party, but then, you know, this violent shooting happened. Is there any, how are you going to enforce social gatherings, you know, in the future, this weekend? How will that be enforced going forward?
I feel responsible for all crime in the city of Syracuse. That's a part of my responsibilities. It's supposed to keep me up at night. It's supposed to get me up in the morning. So I do feel a sense of responsibility for that. As far as how we handled the call from our initial contact with the party goers, we handled it consistently with how we've handled other issues of violations of executive order. And in that regard, I support how the officers handled it. If I had the ability of hindsight, we certainly would have done something maybe more aggressive with some of the people in the crowd there, but we didn't have that information at that time. At the time that we made contact with both the promoters and our observations in the crowd, they were law-abiding on private property.
So, Chief, I know you said, I don't know if I want to touch this. I know you said that you acted in ways that you have responded to all calls regarding social distancing issues prior to this date. Can you talk about the decision of officers in seeing that hundreds, some calculations saying 1,000 people were there? What went into deciding, you know what, we're going to stand off right now, we're not going to try and break this up? Can you talk about that thought process there? And at what point would you step in?
Well, we have, as a city, as a government, as a police department, as leadership, decided that we did not want to criminalize this pandemic. It obviously has impacted our entire community. I'm proud of how the state of New York has responded to this. For much of the time to which our nation was under the microscope, we were a model city as to how we responded to this. And Onondaga County, Syracuse was certainly a part of that. I would tell you that, again, if we had the ability of hindsight, we could always say the things we would have liked to have done to prevent that young man from losing his life and those other 8 victims from being shot. Currently, our position is the same. We make contact, education awareness, and then try to encourage the individuals to comply with the executive order. When you looked at the fact that there were several hundred people there, this notion that we would break that up and issue 500 to 600 people an appearance ticket is just not reasonable. We hate that the fact that 8 people were later shot as a result of that. But I certainly don't put that on the shoulders of the police or the 2 officers that made a decision on the limited information that they had at that time.
And did the climate, the current climate surrounding police officers right now nationally, did that play a role in you deciding not to take any action at that point?
Well, I was not a part of the, per se, myself, but to say that those 2 young officers, was that in the back of their mind? Well, of course it was. You know, every television that you turn on, there is criticism, critique, microscope, scrutiny of the police department, and rightly so. Some of those things have been self-inflicted, and we have to take responsibility for that. But to act as if that they're not thinking in the back of their mind that if I take this aggressive approach when the city has clearly, me being leadership, that has informed them that our approach is contact, education, awareness, and then to encourage them to move along. If they step outside of that, they're probably worried about, well, what are the repercussions if I don't follow the chief's order? So that's on my shoulder. That was the directive that I gave them. But to say that, are they thinking about, I'll be accused of doing this because the party is predominantly minorities? Of course you're thinking it. And you think about it in everything that you do. And all of our officers in our profession are thinking about those things because it's clear that the harm common denominator has been black and brown communities, so we certainly are sensitive to that, and also somewhat, I guess, a little bit maybe second-guessing ourselves on some of the things that we do. But on this day, on that day, I felt like they did what they were supposed to do, and I support their actions.
And now, as far as the investigation, is there anything that's really holding you guys up right now? I imagine you have lots of video of what's going on, and what's really the sticking point here? What's kind of holding the investigation?
Well, I would say the size of the scene, the number of victims that we have. The one thing that I will tell you about aggravated assaults, we get more cooperation. This is not certainly not to say that any of our victims are being uncooperative, but we have a higher clearance rate with actual homicides than we do actually aggravated assaults. Not to mention, when you have this kind of crowd where you don't know where the shot came from, even though you're a victim of this, you may not know as to where that actually occurred or who's responsible for that. So there are things that we have to comb through this very tedious process of all of that information and evidence that is there, the video footage, locating the witnesses once we can see them on video, and then trying to connect all of the dots. But it's an enormous scene, multiple victims, and a significant amount of evidence.
Thank you, Chief.
Mayor Walsh, what's your stance on removing the Columbus statue?
So right now we're just taking questions on last Saturday's incident in police reform. That's next up on my agenda.
Chief Buckner, a police spokesperson had told us last week that the written policy on social distancing and masking was under review. Can you explain a little bit about why it's under review and where that review stands right now?
We continue to provide this top-to-bottom assessment of how we respond both to the public from a citizen standpoint, from a business standpoint, our internal operations in bringing our workforce back like all of the other organizations that are trying to return to the workplace. So all of those things are under constant review. I'm proud of how our city has responded thus far, but we want to continue to make sure that we're looking around corners to try to prevent some of the things that you're seeing around the country where the numbers are starting to go back up. So that's a part of that continuous assessment.
So obviously you have seen some of the video from the scene that night last weekend, and most of the officers, it appear, are not wearing masks. Is that a concern for you? Have you had conversations with them about the importance of wearing masks? Is there a policy in place for them to wear them? And then does the police department, because they are seen by the public, do they have some sort of responsibility to set an example by wearing masks and maintaining social distancing?
We certainly have a responsibility to set the example. When you look at the responsibilities of a police officer, we should be an example of that. There's no question that there have been incidents to where we have been on scenes and not practicing what we ask other people to do. That scene was an enormous scene, and obviously it was chaotic at some point. I can certainly understand that during that initial response, how officers may forget or fail to put on their mask, but at some point during that scene, we probably should have had better discipline with that. As a result of that, we've sent out a new temporary operating procedure to remind officers of the responsibilities and the care that we need to take of ourselves to protect both them and the public. But it's something that we have to do not only with the public, but also with our officers to constantly to remind them that despite the fact that some of our businesses are open and the sun is shining, that a pandemic is still looming in our community.
Okay, and then I do want to just ask you one point in terms of the party that was held. Are you aware of discussions on Rydell Davis's social media platforms that involved telling authorities this would be a Black Lives Matter event to avoid police interruption? There are some posts on there that do indicate that. You know, hey, tell the police this is a Black Lives Matter situation so they won't think this is a large gathering and break us up.
I have seen the post that you're referencing. Obviously, that's one of the things that we would want to interview Mr. Rydell at some point to get some context to that. I think the common sense approach to that would lead one to believe that if, in fact, that was his post, that there were certainly some sinister motives behind what the actual event was versus how it was presented.
And then there are also some discussions and posts on Rydell Davis's social media platforms that involve the sales of liquor. There are some photos that are on there as well. Are you concerned about those posts, these homemade drinks that would be sold for $7 and concerns about underage drinking in terms of that kind of promotion?
Well, anytime you have something that involves our youth being involved, it's concerning. And the fact that someone, if this is true, that was attempting to do that, we certainly want those individuals to be held responsible for that. All of those things are a part of this enormous case that we have, that while that may appear to be less important, it certainly is an intricate piece of us trying to determine who's responsible for the things that occurred on that day from a top-to-bottom standpoint, from the assaults that went there to the approvals that went into allowing it. All of those questions we hope to answer and then pass those cases on to see how we hold individuals responsible for that.
Thank you, Chief.
Got to get Chief out of here in about 3 minutes. So,
Chief,
last couple questions.
Yes, sir.
On some of the, policy changes that are under consideration, such as possibly removing officers from schools.
Yes, sir.
Could you talk about your opinion on that and tell us how many officers are posted to schools these days?
We have 13 officers that are in the school. That includes 10 officers, 2 each in the 5 of the high schools, a supervisor in the rank of sergeant, and then 1 dare and 1 great officer. Obviously, one of the consistent demands made by many of the organizations is to remove police officers from the school. City Hall, myself, has been in communication with the school system as to how we take a look at that. That's obviously not something that we want to just do some kind of knee-jerk reaction to the demand, but we certainly want to be mindful of the fact that consistently that's been asked of us. Part of that is administratively looking at what we do today, what that would look like going forward in the future. There are many people and parties that have a vested interest in this, specifically students, faculty, staff, and their parents. And then on our side of the equation, obviously, City Hall and the police department. So at the appropriate time, we will all sit down, put all the information on the table, and determine what that model will look like going forward.
Okay, so you don't have a position or a plan on that?
I think my position is well documented.
Okay.
And I'll just add to that, Tim. I mean, the chief has been clear with me and with the community that he would gladly take those 13 officers and apply them to the many other challenges that the police department and our community are facing. And as chief, that's certainly within his right to have that opinion, and it's one that that is certainly tempting given all the challenges that we have in the community. But as the chief pointed out, there are a lot of stakeholders involved in this decision: our students, their families, our teachers, our administrators, and if it was solely up to the chief and would only impact the chief, again, he's made his position clear that he'll take those officers and put them on the streets. That may be where we end up, but out of respect to all of the people impacted by this decision, we're in full agreement that we need to engage in a process that gets us to a good outcome, both for the police department, but more importantly, for our young people and for our schools.
Okay. I think there's been at least one news report, too, where the union president suggested that there may be a number of retirements or requests for transfer coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement or the reforms associated with it. Are you seeing anything like that, Chief?
I have not seen what I would call a spike yet in retirement. We're kind of seeing our normal numbers. I won't lie to you and tell you that it's not a concern. And some of that is not necessarily in response to the protests or the things that we've seen. It's just that at some point in people's career, they've had their fill. There's no secret that their things are changing in our profession. I think that we have been very, very clear that we denounced the actions that occurred in Minneapolis. We accept some responsibility that we've caused harm in our communities at times. Our profession is changing. I think we should all see this as an opportunity to positively move forward. The Syracuse Police Department is not going into this kicking and screaming because we recognize that some of the complaints that we're seeing across the country, we've had those same complaints in our backyard. I think that we are a good police department, but we certainly have opportunity for improvement. And as we move forward, there may be some people that, as a result of this, that may decide that this is no longer for them.
Okay, and real quick, there's been some discussion of, in the future, perhaps some types of emergency calls would be answered by non-officers. Can you give any sort of examples or thoughts on how that might work?
We would want to have an opportunity to something that is non-criminal. Let's say it's a homeless situation or someone in a mental illness crisis that doesn't involve a weapon, it doesn't involve a crime that's being committed, then we would have someone be the primary first responder in that regard, and then we would take a secondary role. All of those things, the same as with the officers in the school, we have to have conversations with the appropriate people to make sure that the service that we replace our current footprint with it is something that is adequate and that meets the needs of our community.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. One last question, sir.
Try to make this quick for you. You mentioned earlier, going back to the shooting, that second guessing might have had a small part of it in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and how the country's so sensitive with that now. How do you prevent second guessing of the police officers from trickling into future incidents and their
Well, second guessing, if that was my term, I would prefer not to use that term. But is it in their mind thinking about the things that are circulating around them and the scrutiny that a police are under when they're engaged in this party? Of course it is. And the way that we would ask them to move forward in addressing future issues, you know your training, you know our policies, you know what we expect of you. We expect you to do your job. When you're right, I'm going to support you. When you're wrong, I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm going to do both with the same amount of energy. I've been consistent about that. In this example, I felt like that they did the right thing based upon what we've asked them to do, despite this horrific outcome. But I expect them to step up and do their jobs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chief. Yep. Just before I move on to my last section here, I did just on Tim, on your question about calls, I just want to remind folks that we do have a 211 line here in service in the community, and the chief mentioned homeless individuals. That's a perfect example of a transition that we've really already made as a community, where if people happen to see someone that's living out on the street, maybe they are expressing some concerning behaviors, but ultimately aren't committing a crime. I think probably a few years ago, the inclination, if any action would be taken, would be to call 911, whereas now it is to call 211. And we have resource providers from In My Father's Kitchen to the Rescue Mission that regularly respond to those calls, and we end up with good outcomes. So I think we've already done some of that informally, but we're going to use this opportunity to formalize some of that. Okay, so there was a question about the Columbus statue, which leads me to the last area that I want to talk about. Obviously, we're talking about different things that are happening in Syracuse and around the country, and related to the protests and the movements around the issues of inequality and systemic racism. Many individuals have turned their focus onto a number of symbols and statues, including statues of Christopher Columbus. Of course, we have one here in the city of Syracuse, downtown in Columbus Circle. It's something that, from the moment that I walked in the doors of City Hall, I've said I have real concerns with the message that having that statue in the center of our community, what message that sends to people within our community. And I'm proud to say that from the moment I walked through the door, we've been deeply engaged in addressing those concerns. So just as a reminder for those that may not be aware, the first step in the process was we engaged with Interfaith Works to convene a series of dialogue circles. I'm a big proponent of dialogue as a way to advance education, understanding, empathy, and Interfaith Works has a great dialogue program. So we convened 3 dialogue circles around the issues of Columbus, Columbus Day, Columbus the statue, and we engaged with a diverse group of stakeholders in those dialogue circles, from indigenous peoples, members of the Onondaga Nation, Italian Americans, people who had opinions that spanned the spectrum on this topic. And they were very productive. At the completion of those 3 dialogue circles, Interfaith Works prepared a report, which they've delivered to us. We put it out on our social media platforms as well as our website. I encourage people to read it. It's very informative. I learned through that process, and I think everyone who was involved would agree that they learned things about our own history that we weren't aware of, and that's critically important. One of the key findings that jumped out to me from the report was that at the basis of the very differing viewpoints on Columbus, righting the wrongs of oppression at different times in history are again common among all of those that have an opinion on Columbus. From the oppression that Italian Americans saw as new immigrants in this country to, of course, the oppression and genocide faced by our indigenous people here in this country. It was that common theme of oppression that informed all of the opinions that we heard. While the report certainly didn't identify a perfect solution or outcome for all parties involved, it did help to guide me, and I think others, in a direction of where we go from here. One of the recommendations was around establishing what was described as a heritage or education and learning site in and around the public space that is now Columbus Circle. As I reflect on the process, it has certainly reaffirmed my view that maintaining the status quo in Columbus Circle is not an acceptable outcome in this day and age. The dialogue that I read about and witnessed some myself was emotional and hard, but it ultimately did lead to education and to some level of healing. And that was the other thing that everyone involved in the process agreed upon. Any steps we take forward have to be rooted in a path towards healing and not work to further divide and inflict pain on our community. And that's why I gravitated towards the idea of this more comprehensive educational heritage site, because, again, I think the path to healing is rooted in education and dialogue. So we've had a lot of dialogue. It's time for action. And so the next step in the process, which I'm formally announcing today, is that I am forming a Columbus Circle Action Group. This group, similar to the dialogues, will include voices of Native Americans, Italian Americans, Black and other communities of color, advocacy organizations, government, and dialogue participants that we've already been engaged with. The group will advise the city and me on the creation of an all-season education and learning site at Columbus Circle, including recommendations on the presence of the monument in the circle. I want a site that tells the story of indigenous peoples, the horrors of colonialism, the oppression experienced at multiple points in our history, and the Onondaga land on which we stand and our honored place as the birthplace of democracy. When I convened these dialogue circles, I made a commitment to seek understanding, common ground, and again, healing for our community. I want the opportunity to finish the job, and I think that this action group presents us with that opportunity. We have a protest or a rally scheduled this weekend around the idea of removing the statue. I've engaged with some of the organizers of that group, and I very much respect their opinion. But my feeling right now is to tear down the statue is easy. It's a symbol, like a lot of symbols that we've been talking about. Educating and healing a community, that's the hard work, and that's what we need to be focused on. And again, I think through the process that we've been involved in to date and will advance through this action group, that is the hard work that will, I believe, lead to healing for everyone in our community, and ultimately my goal is for it to serve as a model for other communities in the country. So I look forward to assembling that group and to continuing this very important work, and again, the goal being that we as a community and as a people come together and learn and ultimately heal. With that, happy to answer questions.
I think you already said this, but the creation of this group, it sounds like you are committing to creating some sort of a heritage education site, but not yet committing to what happens to the statue, whether it stays or goes.
That's right. It is my intention that through this action group and through the planning that goes into this site, we will come to a final determination on what on the presence of that statue and how it fits into this broader vision.
What's your time frame for that?
It's a good question that I don't have a perfect answer to yet, Tim. As I've said about whether it's police reform or systemic racism, what we've heard loud and clear from the community is that there is a sense of urgency, and people want to see action. And I feel that urgency, and I intend to heed that call. So I intend to convene this group as quickly as possible. But until we bring everyone together, out of respect for the participants, I don't want to commit to an arbitrary deadline. But I do know that, again, I think all stakeholders that I've talked to want to bring this discussion and this debate to some sort of resolution, and so we're going to act swiftly to do that.
And how will the final decision be made? Is that yours alone, or?
It's another good question, Tim. I certainly, as mayor, I have some authority over the decision, but Columbus Circle is part of a federally designated historic district, and I think we need to understand the implications of that. I think that we need to understand the implications of how that statue was donated to the city, and what, if any, provisions were included within that transfer of property. Those are things that I don't have a crystal clear handle on yet, which is again another reason why even if I thought that tearing the statue down right now was the right thing to do, I don't have answers to the questions that I think I would need to have in order to take that action. I mean, again, I certainly have authority as mayor, but I'm not a dictator. I'm not, I serve the people. I represent the people, and I'm just one branch of government. So this is something that, ultimately, while I don't expect that there ever to be a consensus with all those that I serve on what should be done, I want to make sure that everyone who I serve has the opportunity to engage in this process in the appropriate way, and ultimately, to help inform a decision that I will likely make with other stakeholders as well.
I should know this, but is that technically city parkland?
It is city-owned property. There's a distinction around formal parkland that I'm not sure, Julie, if that technically qualifies for. Do you know? Yeah, so we treat it like a park. Whether or not it's formally parked land, I don't know off the top of my head, but I think that's another part of the discussion, because if you're altering that parkland, that has implications as well. But we treat it like any other park.
Thanks.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah. I have questions about the pool. Can I ask that now, or are you just...
About the...
Pools?
Oh, about the pools, yes, please.
Yeah. Where did the city get the money to open the 2 pools? I know you said there was financial issues.
Yeah, so in terms of funding the 2 pools that we're funding, I mean, ultimately it was a decision that I made where we have to. Right now, we are in contingency spending mode where we're developing a number of different contingency spending plans that account for a number of different financial outcomes. So at this point, we are estimating what the financial losses associated with COVID-19 are, and it's a moving target. So as I've asked every department to prepare contingency spending plans, I had to look at where parks felt they could make appropriate cuts and where we wanted to draw the line at this point in time, knowing that we don't know exactly where we're going to end up with financial loss, and we also don't know where we're going to end up with the federal government hopefully delivering some financial aid to cities. So, you can look at it from the perspective of we are spending money to open up pools, but you can just as easily look at it as we're not opening up to 6 pools, or at least 4 pools. We've already made the determination that 4 pools that are normally open every year and have been for as long as I recall are not opening this year because of our financial crisis. So I had to balance the financial cost of opening those 2 pools versus the cost to our community who look to those pools as a source of relief. And ultimately, I felt that it was worth that investment, and I'm hoping that the community feels like it's worth an investment of their own to help us get to those 4 pools.
For the fundraiser, is there a deadline?
Yeah, so we have essentially run out of runway for getting pools open for a reasonable amount of time. So we are, the 2 pools that we've identified, again, Schiller and Kirk, will open July 16th, and I think are scheduled to close around August 20th, right? Our biggest, we've been getting complaints for years that people would like us to keep our pools open through the end of August. Our challenge is many of our lifeguards are college students, and so we just can't keep them open any longer than that. But the earliest we can now open these 2 pools is July 16th. So at some point, it just doesn't make sense. So we felt like we had to make a decision literally today, just so we could have a couple pools open for 4 or 5 weeks. And so that's how we got there.
And how confident are you that you'll be able to meet that goal?
Well, I believe in our community. We are a giving community. We are a resilient community, and I have no doubt that the desire will be there and that we will see people step up. What I don't know is, just as we are hurting financially, a lot of other people are too, and everyone has to make the difficult decision about where they're going to invest their limited resources. I'm hopeful that there's enough people and businesses in this community that will see the value in giving some of our young people, in particular in our city, who don't have a whole lot more to look forward to in the summer. We'll give them this gift. But again, we've never done this before. Again, I want to credit the Parks Conservancy for being willing to take this leap with us. That's what they were. This is a big part of why they were created, to be able to step in situations like this and to help us. So I'm hopeful that in doing this, we're going to create a model that we can hopefully use for other areas. But this is an unprecedented time, and what I've learned early on in this crisis is not to predict what's going to happen, a week from now. But I believe in our community, and I'm hopeful that people are going to step up.
And then last question, how do you feel about the AIM funding cuts that were announced earlier this week?
Yeah, so again, just another example of the unprecedented fiscal challenges that we are facing as the city of Syracuse. One of the challenges that we're dealing with is our community has been kind of conditioned over the past decade or so to believe that the city of Syracuse has no money, and so it's in some ways, it's people could accuse me of being Chicken Little, but this is different. This is way different than anything that we've been facing. The city has faced fiscal challenges for a long time, but I've also been very open in saying that I'm really proud of the hard work that we've done as an administration and the Common Council has done with us to turn around that ship and to get us on a path to fiscal sustainability. And again, we were on that path as recently as right before COVID hit. We were estimating a surplus this year of over $1 million. So this isn't about bailing out a poorly managed city. This is a city on the rise that is facing an unprecedented situation. And I have no doubt that if the federal government steps up and gives us the relief that we deserve, that we will get right back on that path, not only to fiscal sustainability, but to the vision that we have for the city and the growth and creating opportunity for all. This is, I hope, just a pause on that path. And the federal government ultimately is going to determine whether or not that's the case. Again, the act that the state took and again, for those that aren't familiar, we receive about a little over $71 million in state aid. The last payment of our current fiscal year, which ends at the end of this month, and the first payment of the state's fiscal year was scheduled to be a little over $61 million. So the vast majority of our annual allocation of state aid was scheduled to come this month. What we received literally in our account this morning was a little over $49 million. So we took over a $12 million hit from the state. It's disappointing. It's frustrating. The state has said at this point they're withholding it. They're not cutting it. So we're gonna give them the benefit of the doubt. And I understand that they're in the very same position that we're in. So it's not personal, but it is incredibly challenging, and it just further heightens the urgency of getting the federal government to step up and to deliberate.
Just want to quickly go back to the Columbus statue. You said that you're having dialogue about it. You don't know the future of the statue. Do you actually think that there is a potential future with a happy Syracuse and the statue still being up and we having protests about it soon? Do you actually think that you can keep the statue up and also keep the people happy?
I don't want to predetermine the outcome. Again, that's the purpose of convening this action group, is to come up with the right plan of action. And do I think that everyone will think it's the right plan? I don't. Again, I've already come to the conclusion that the status quo in Columbus Circle today is not acceptable. There are many people that do, and so I've already, I'm sure, upset some people, and it's the nature of this business. My job is not to necessarily make everyone happy. It's to do the right thing and to represent those that I serve, and that's the goal. And again, I think that we can come up with a solution that leads to healing for our community, and that's the goal.
You mentioned earlier when you first took office, you had concerns about the Columbus statue. Is there a reason that only now, with the whole movement and everything going on in the country, that now is the time that these conversations are really being had?
Well, again, I'll liken it to the police reform discussion. Deputy Mayor and I and the chief, since he's been here, have been working every day on police reform. And have made progress on police reform. Similarly with the Columbus issue. From the moment we walked in, we started a process that has been moving forward. It has never stopped moving forward. The moment that we are in as a city and as a country has given us an opportunity to accelerate that progress. That's a good thing. And so that's what I'm seeing this as. It's an opportunity to accelerate the progress that we've already been making.
Thank you.
One question for Deputy Mayor Owens, if you would. So I think it was less than 2 years ago, we had the shooting, the Midland Avenue shooting, where a number of people were shot, including an 8-year-old child. And at that time, you came on our show afterwards and issued this impassioned plea to the community to stop the violence, to stop this from happening. And here we are again with another one of these mass shootings. So I want to give you the opportunity to reiterate those concerns you had then, but then also look ahead to why have we not seen progress since then? Why is this continuing to happen?
Let me first of all say that the vast, and I can't emphasize that enough, vast majority of our citizens are not running around the city of Syracuse harming other people. They're going to and fro, doing everything, raising their families, and doing everything that we all do. There is a small contingency of individuals who are making the choice of picking up a gun and harming other people. we don't have enough time to talk about what got them to that point. And so this is a twofold conversation about holding people accountable for their actions, but also addressing all the social and economic ills that put people in a position where they see no other form of recourse. There is nothing easy about that. Government plays a role. It is by far the end-all and be-all to that answer. But I am encouraged. People in this community care about this community. What happened last Saturday, people are just completely angry, appalled about, and responding to it appropriately, as they did on 2 years ago. They will continue to be voices in this community to stop violence, but they are also voices, and you're seeing them walking these streets every single day about all the other things that are maybe putting some of us in positions that we see no other recourse than to find pseudo strength or something in empowering myself through violence. We have to figure out why that is the case. We have to address our poverty issues, our housing issues, our food desert issues, our daycare crisis that we're in. So many different things that contribute to it. But I've said over and over again, Syracuse is not the place I was born, but it is the place I call home. And I continue to be proud of it. I continue to be proud of our citizens. And I just want to also just say again, the vast majority of our individuals are going to spend every waking day of their lives making this city better.
So then just as a follow-up to that, do you think that there is something within this greater Black Lives Matter movement and the police reforms that we're discussing and addressing that will then start to chip away at some of the, where do these people begin their lives and where do they end up?
Oh, by no means. This is starting with police reform, but it is not ending with police reform. It is about housing segregation. It is about economic opportunity and equity. It is about the work that we're doing in city government right now and being held accountable for even how equitable and inclusive and diverse and accessible what we do in city government is. This is a conversation that is happening in every home, every boardroom, every company, every municipality in this country, and it's long overdue.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend. Please be safe.